In the passage from the Acts of the Apostles today, we have coming through an important intuition given to the early church that there is a differentiation of roles. This reading applies to our time more than we may care to think. Let us see what is going on. There is an increase in numbers. There is, therefore, an increase in administration. The outworking of this element of being of one heart and mind is that charity is concrete, and therefore a distribution of charity exists in material help. This is the beginnings of administration as we know it. Instinctively, the authority seen in the presiding elders, the apostles, is something which, as in the case of Moses many centuries earlier, clutters his life and clutters their life in a similar way. And it is perceived that this is damaging their ministry. Therefore, let us differentiate. And here we have the setting apart. We have the making of servants. Diakonein is to serve. And this is the beginning of the order of deacons as we know it, which always remained clear in the structure of the church. Study of the early documents indicates that the threefold and clearly differentiated system of bishop, priest and deacon was fully in place already in Antioch at an early stage. But there is a certain amount of lack of historic clarity as to whether at all stages in the beginning the difference between episkopos and presbyteros was fully understood by all. That is a study in itself. It's something, however, that the Protestants took advantage of. Hence we have in their situation the notion that a presbyter could actually ordain, and that has led to things like the Lutheran situation now, which has received its orders from a priest, Luther, and not a bishop, and also the Anglican situation, which led not so much in the Anglican situation itself, but to what came from it, the Wesleyan reform. The Wesleys were Anglican clergymen, but presbyters and not bishops, and they were able, in their mind, to hand on. The same thing happened in Wales under Thomas Charles in about 1801, thereby having this perpetuation of church divisions, which were based then on receiving orders from what had initially been priests. But all this was based on arguing from the New Testament that it was not clear. However, it was there, and in the Lord's mind. It was clear already in the upper room. The apostles, including Judas, were ordained bishops. Now, that is the fullness of priesthood. As time went on, it became more clear, and the evolution happened under the direct inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that there should be the direct, visible continuation of apostolic authority in the one central figure of the bishop, who had the fullness of order, but that he would need collaboration. However, in the early stages, it was nearly always the bishop who celebrated, who presided at the Eucharist, and his presbyters would be as a crown around him. As time went on, with evangelization, the regions to be served became ever wider, and therefore the presbyters also became independent in the celebration of the Eucharist. However, there was always a link with the bishop. The eulogy was carried from the bishop to the priest, and there's a vestige of that now in the mingling of the body and blood of Christ just before Holy Communion. That is a trace of what was there in early church practice, that the union with the bishop would have been seen in the carrying of the eulogy that is part of the consecrated host to the bishop's delegate in an area, the priest. That disappeared fairly quickly, but the vestiges have remained, and the element of communion with the bishop is still there to this day, in the obligation to mention not one's own bishop actually, but the bishop of the area where one is. And that is a reminder of the way in which the church is incarnate geographically under a bishop in an area somewhere around the world. So there's always a bishop to make reference to. The Bishop of Rome, our patriarch in the West, has also to be mentioned, as in the East, the patriarch of their patriarchates has to be mentioned as well. And this element is important because it shows where we belong, under whose jurisdiction we are. And the priest is never acting under his own authority, he is acting under the authority of his bishop at all times, and should never say or do anything against the wishes of the same. Nihil sine episcopo, with the thought of St. Ignatius, nothing without the bishop. And so we have the continuity from the earliest times of this, the Levite as it were, the deacon who was from the beginning in part of the church structure, as we see here in the Acts of the Apostles, and was to be an important figure in some churches more than others. To this day, in the East, the deacon can be quite important, and over the centuries in the West, deacons were frequently future bishops and indeed popes. And there was a theological question of what would happen if one ordained to the episcopate, to the episcopacy, one who was only a deacon. It was called ordinatio per saltum, ordination by jump. And theologically it is possible because the episcopate contains all else, and therefore it contains the fullness of the priesthood, therefore the priesthood. But some in early church history would have been promoted from deacon to bishop. We can see that happening. And the reason is this, that one deacon in particular, the archdeacon, would have had authority precisely over administration. And even to this day, in the Anglican situation, they still call the main administrator of an area the archdeacon, and he also is someone very much in view when it becomes a question of ordaining somebody to bishop of an area, because he has a lot of experience with regard to administration on the level of goods and property and things that have to happen materially. So these deacons are important, hence we see how the martyrdom of Lawrence is indicating the importance of the main deacon of Rome, because he was thought to have great wealth under his control, having administration of church goods. And so he was given special treatment, in inverted commas, even after his Pope Sixtus and the others had already been martyred. Hence he is celebrated a few days after the others who had their martyrdom a little bit before, having had this exquisite torture of being burned slowly on a gridiron. You can turn me over now, I'm done on this side. The deacon then was always there, and it was an intuition given at the time of the council that it should be repristinated in its importance as an order self-sufficient, because in the West it had become more or less automatically a step towards ordination, the transient diaconate. But it was felt that it should be made an order self-sufficient, and that therefore the question of celibacy should be looked into with regard to that order. However, the ancient discipline of not giving a major order to someone who already is married and wants to marry again or something, or if he's not married and wants to marry, has been maintained. For the deacon, if he loses his wife, does not remarry, and if he's not married, does not marry. That goes right back to the early centuries, and that is universal, that the major orders do not allow for the exercise of the sacrament of matrimony. There's a bit of grey area in the early centuries, and of course in the Gregorian reform in the 1000s, 1100s there was a tightening of the vice in the western part of Christendom. But the question then remains, what is the role of the deacon? Well, we see it here. Essentially, it's service. It also is important for preaching, and the deacon is to be valued for what he is. One has some very sad situations now over the West where some priests will not really respect the dignity of the deacon and allow them to preach as much as they ought to. They reserve that sometimes to themselves exclusively, and that is not fair, because quite often deacons actually can be better than the priest, because if they have a specialized ministry they can develop it far more. It is something to be looked into. And also the whole question of what the Holy Spirit had in mind at the Second Vatican Council needs to be looked into, because in some areas, notably in Ireland, the diaconate was not taken on, permanent diaconate, and therefore what we had in Ireland has damaged profoundly the church, because we have a situation where a shortcut system came in, and those who were to be the ordinary ministers of Holy Communion not being there, it was felt that lay people should be brought in, and we had this very, very elastic system which has damaged profoundly respect for the Blessed Sacrament, where very easily people come up who are not needed. Had it been maintained as the Holy Spirit wanted, that there should be deacons, and therefore one or two deacons in every decent parish throughout the church, who might have a job as well, and might have a family, then this would all have been avoided. In good parishes on the continent, they are well able to produce one or two deacons, and that is the correct way. It avoids all this shortcut system which has profoundly damaged the visibility of the difference between roles. These are ordained for a ministry. Now, originally the deacon liturgically was the minister of the chalice, and that can be seen in iconography. St. Lawrence, St. Stephen, they'd be portrayed perhaps with a chalice, whatever, as well as the instrument of torture. But the chalice was their ministry. Now, with regard to this question of differentiation of roles and therefore liberation for those who have a certain role, it is important because on parish level and in other areas of church life, if correctly understood, it is a teaching which the Lord wants us to grasp. If one is ordained for the sacred and for the ministry of souls, for the service of God and the service of immortal souls directly, that is one's prime task. And therefore, if other things encroach on that could be delegated to others, then the priest is not doing actually what he's ordained for, at least sufficiently. In our day, there is another element coming in. It's that comes in from, for instance, very well qualified priests who are good at everything, including things technical, and therefore will spend much time, for instance, producing a parish bulletin or whatever it might be, and doing things which have an effect with regard to administration and efficiency because they're competent on several levels, but their time is going into this. Also, administration has become more a group effort when a clergyman has to preside not only over the Eucharist but also over a board meeting, and spends much time in board meetings, and that is not direct soul-to-soul ministry. One is, as it were, preparing soul ministry, and also one might be delegating things to lay people which are actually priestly in nature, because the time of the priest has gone to these other things. So this needs to be looked into, because the Acts of the Apostles is already hinting at this at a distance. One needs to be what one is. The time of a consecrated soul who has powers given unto him by the Holy Spirit this is therefore that of the church and that of souls, that of the service of God, who is outside time, and not someone, God that is, who needs to be pushed to the side because of other things which in his name are more important. No, God needs to reign over the time of those consecrated to him, and the praise must be the essence of their life. From there the rest will come, and to there the rest will lead. Our life has to be based on the sacred and based on the house of God. The proportion between time spent outside the house of God And that inside has to be looked at. If all the time one is outside the house of God, then one is actually too much on the human. Now that's not perceived for what it is actually, because it's also coming in to the way in which we curtail the time given to God, in the way that we give again to lay people ministries in church which speed up the work of God. The correct way is to let God have enough time to speak to his people and minister to his people. If we're not a contemplative people, then we're all great at doing things, but not good at absorbing things or feeling things. We're on the outside of ourselves and not in the depth. And God is in the depth, as we see in the teaching given by St. John. For these readings in this Easter tide talk about the Trinitarian nature of our God. Here we have always this jump between Father, Son and Holy Spirit in preparation precisely for the coming of the Paraclete. The promises of the Lord are there, and this high tone, this high language must be our tone. We are handling not the things of men, but the things of God. Our duty is to bring others not unto us, not to just events where many things happen, but to an encounter with the calm, unhurried God that made us.
Diaconein, to serve as deacon. Je vais voir l'archevêque pour les ordinations. I'm going to see the archbishop about the ordinations. The prior said this before setting off for Siena in 1996. O word of butter preacher, come again, not from the pen of etchings, but from this, the heart that heard the heart, that saw the pain and softer joy within a sigh of bliss. Come, come and go across the rows of ears that capture what moves here. Go, go thy way into the breast that shed this night its tears, and to the brain that strayed this way this day. Die, planted lie upon the morrow's thought, and touch e'en such as came not hither well to gaze at beauty hid. Sound dimly wrought with syllables to steal a soul from hell, be found tomorrow where a sorrow breaks the heart, cuirassed that heeds, and small heed take